Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Welcome. And our objective for this hour is to bring a level of awareness with an educational component. And this conversation is for the JFO staff. We invited the board of directors of the agencies on the campus because we really appreciate their support for the staff. So thank you for joining us. I wanted to break down the racial makeup of the employees at the JFO, so I took a particular pay date. And we have 42 employees who identify as Asian. We have a lot of people who are part of the Karen community, typically from Myanmar and Thailand. There are 34 employees who have identified as Black. There are 25 employees who have identified as Latino. 8 employees who have identified as 2 races or more, and 406 employees who have identified as white. And you might think, do we really have that many employees? The JCC employs a lot of people who might teach a class 1 or 2 times a week. So there's a lot of part-time employees. We have seasonal staff. So we do have a lot of people on payroll. At the home, there's probably about 180 people who are, and most people at the home are full-time typically. So our facilitator today is Earl Redrick. He's the ADL Mediator, Facilitator, Trainer, and Professional Coach. And I want to thank Sharon Commissar Langdon for referring Earl. Thank you very much. Every day we do a lot of Jewish programming, Jewish education, Jewish outreach. But for this next hour, we are dedicating the hour to Black lives. So Earl, welcome, and thank you for being here. And the stage is yours.
Thank you all for having me. I'm excited. Just a couple of opening remarks for staff and individuals who may be of the Jewish community. I don't know, I find it fascinating, some of the things I've learned and the journeys that I've taken to understand the atrocities experienced by folks of the Holocaust. I just read another book recently by Philip Hale. I don't know if anybody on the call knows who he is, but a very fascinating writer who writes very passionately about some of the experiences of him and his family. So I just want to say thank you all for having me and thinking about inclusion in the backdrop of the experiences of many of your own ancestors. Also, to members on the call, I know you guys have a fairly diverse staff who may be included in what we refer to as dockers or dreamers. I don't know how many of your staff that includes, but I just want to say I'm glad and relieved and very thankful that the Supreme Court made the best and the right decision to allow you all to stay in a country that probably the only country that you know as contributing members and everything except for the designation of citizen, you all have been and carry out yourselves as citizens. So I'm very thankful. And as I crisscross the state of Nebraska, I get to see many of our DACA individuals across the state. So kudos to you all, and I'm glad that issue is at least behind us for now. And the last thing, before we dive into it, just 2 quick definitions so that we understand the context of what we're talking about today. The first is the difference between racist and racism. Can somebody chime in for me real quick, just to help us understand what the difference is? Because I think in this current context, I see a lot of social media and a lot of finger pointing about what those 2 words mean and how they've traditionally or historically been applied. And there's just a very small nuance, a difference between what they mean. So anybody want to help us out? Just chime in, please. Or you can type it in the chat box if you want to. I'm looking in the chat box if you don't want to comment. Anybody, please.
You said the difference between racist and racism?
Yes, sir.
Well, racism is going to be a subset of prejudice and biases with the ability to oppress somebody else. whereas racism or racist, excuse me, is going to be an individual's own actions and thoughts behind those prejudices.
Absolutely. You couldn't have said it more poignantly. That's what I want folks to understand. So when we hear and we are understanding the context of the conversation today, please understand it's from a lens of racism, the institutionalized oppression, systemic in nature for centuries long. Some of the stuff that we're going to talk about today, you all may or may not be aware, but think about it in terms of not just an individual, as folks are saying, an individual bad actor, which I don't necessarily know if I like that term, but the institution itself, whether it's the institution of education, the institution of law enforcement, the institution of public policies and how those things happen. So just keep that in mind. Now, I think I'm supposed to share my screen at this point so you guys can see my, oh, Jennifer, I think you gotta let me share my screen, or do you have the presentation?
Yes, I will share it. So I'll open that up and share my screen for you.
And we're gonna do the condensed one that I sent this
Yes.
morning? Okay,
Yes.
yes, ma'am. And I'll just say next slide if that works.
Yes. So hold on one
Sounds good.
second here.
I've heard a lot of conversation about racism, and folks get very defensive, not really understanding the difference between the two.
Now, are you seeing my screen or not?
Not at this time.
Ah, shoot. Okay, I'll keep working on it.
So I guess I can move on because we're still kind of at the opening matter. So three things that we're going to talk about today. Still can't see it though, Jennifer.
I know.
Oh,
Hold
no,
on.
That's fine. I'm tech challenged as well. But three things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about well, let me preface. There is no way we could have this conversation in 1 hour. There are way too many tentacles, complexities, levels. There's so much of this that we can talk about it. We could take a week seminar on this and still walk away with, we didn't cover everything. So we're gonna cram it into an hour, and I'm gonna focus on racism in two particular institutions. First will be the intersection of race and law enforcement, because that's really what brought us to this current climate. And the second one I'm gonna talk about is public policy and race, and how those things are looked at, have factored out over the past centuries. And I'm gonna specifically use Omaha, the data in Omaha, to make that point on public policy. So as soon as we get the slides up, we will talk about race and law enforcement.
Right here.
All right. Yes, there we have it. Okay. We can go to the second slide, the next slide. Okay, that's just a quick public policy piece. I didn't say what, but we're going to talk about redlining, what that is, what it looked like, and what happened to historically African-American communities during that particular time and continuing today. So if you've not heard that term, you can Google it real quick, but we'll jump back to that here later. And then last thing we'll talk about is next steps and how you all can get involved. And essentially, my next step to you is please don't allow this to be a one-time conversation. It is impossible. Next slide, Jennifer. So current climate, law enforcement, race. I'll tell you, I'm not a subject matter expert on Black Lives Matter. I do support it. I do think that the young people who have started that particular movement, they were ahead of the curve before the rest of the country, and now a large portion corporations are understanding what their true intent was. These young people who started that are ahead of the curve. So I will share some comments on Black Lives Matter, but I'm not the subject matter expert, because I did start the movement and not active, although I do support it. But the historical impact of race and law enforcement. First of all, what you're seeing, this conflux of in our environment right now, really reflects our inability as a country to truly address race and racism. One of the references that you have in front of you is a wonderful book, probably the best in this entire series of material that you have, by Byron Stevenson, called Just Mercy. If you didn't read the book, there was a movie that they made about it. But as always, the movies don't do it justice. You have to read the book. He did a phenomenal job of helping us understand the intersection of race in the criminal justice system. And in his book, he talked about there was 4 institutions that really have shaped how we deal and talk about race today. And those 4 institutions, he said, were slavery, the re-enslavement post-Civil War. And for just quick edification, essentially as we're celebrating the end of slavery on June 19th, when the Civil War ended and slaves were freed, those folks were somehow, through the criminal justice system, re-enslaved to continue working the plantations, although they were apparently incarcerated, but still working on plantations. The Jim Crow era, and then mass incarceration. Many folks are like, oh, mass incarceration just started. No, mass incarceration started more than a century ago, if not longer, maybe a century and a half ago, mass incarceration started. And there's some wonderful data you can find on mass incarceration. The common thread between these 4 institutions, law enforcement was either active or indirectly participated in enforcing these 4 institutions. Hence, you have this current animosity, this angst, you can even say fear with the African-American community and law enforcement. I would extend that to say communities of color and impoverished communities and law enforcement, because that also supports that the lower the socioeconomic status, the more likely there's going to be policing and a disparate impact in what that policing looked like when you get to impoverished communities. But today we're just focusing on the African-American community. A tidbit, and I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, African slaves were the only large minority group to come to the Americas in bondage. I should say North America, or come to the US in bondage. I did not know that until a couple of years ago, which is phenomenal, right? When we think about all the minority groups that came here, we were the only ones that came here in bondage and enslaved. So some of that provides a little bit of the context between what we're seeing play out and the anger, the distrust, and the frustration that's going on. Of course, unless you've been, I guess, on the moon for the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen even more vividly some of those interactions with law enforcement, especially Black and brown males face. And the data just doesn't lie. We can explain the data any way we want to, but the likelihood of a Black or brown young man encountering law enforcement and then having deadly encounters 2 to 3 times higher than any other group. So that's kind of troubling in the current focus of the frustration. Next slide, please. Why does Black lives matter, and why we need to be very mindful of saying all lives matter? You can say that. I'm not going to tell you not to say that. But I'm gonna be candid here. As an African-American man, I've not had those type of run-ins with the law enforcement system. Have I been stopped? Have I been harassed? I can give you oodles and noodles of examples of a 16-year-old kid working at McDonald's, and the fastest way to my house was to cut through Baylor campus. I couldn't tell you how many times the same cop, the same car, see the same kid in the same McDonald's uniform cutting across Baylor campus to get stopped and say, where are you going? Same place I was going last night, or the night before, or the Saturday before. So it kind of hurts. To me, it hurts and it's disingenuous when I see folks like, why can't we just say all lives matter? We can, and I don't think Black Lives Matter is saying all lives don't matter. What the core message I think Black Lives Matter is saying, and somebody else can chime in if they like, is that until we start to appreciate and value Black lives as they encounter the law enforcement system equally, same treatment, same justice, then yes, Black lives have to matter and have to be an important part of this conversation right now. I'm not saying that a white life doesn't matter, or a Native life does not matter. That's not the messaging. And if folks take that as the messaging, I would encourage you to have a conversation, because that's not the messaging at all. Blacks account for, did anybody want to say anything at this point? No? Or shoot me I guess use the chat feature if you want to chime in real quick. Blacks account for 14% of the US population, but they make up almost, depending on what data set you're looking at, 38 to 40% of those folks incarcerated. More than 1 in 3 Black males can anticipate some contact with the criminal justice system. Think about that for a second. 1 in 3 over their lifetime will have some contact with the criminal justice system. That to me hurts. That's very, very difficult to accept, because either you have to have 1 or 2 positions on that. Either your position is Black males are historically more criminal in nature, which I would be very hurt by, but you can have that position, or there's somehow the system has the spirit contact with Black males. I don't know how else you could explain that particular data set. So that's painful to deal with. Accounting for all aspects of the criminal justice system, including contact, charges, sentencing, parole, probation, any part of that system, Blacks and Hispanics account for approximately 67 to 69% of all those people in the system. But Blacks and Hispanics only represent 31% of the US population. Again, another data set that's hard to explain. The weaponization of race against Blacks and other minorities is also factored into this. I think just recently, I forget the young lady's name in New York, who, her dog is unleashed, and the gentleman is telling her get her dog. She calls the police on him and then says, she didn't use the language, but in a sense, the big angry Black guy is attacking me, or he's threatening me. I mean, I don't know about you all, but when I saw that, I was crushed, because essentially what she was doing is calling the institution out to deal with a person where his chances of death was 3 times higher than anybody else. And now you're calling him out there saying that he's threatening you. That was as equally painful as any of the other incidents that I've seen, because it made me even more fearful that folks will get on the phone and just weaponize race in an instant. I hadn't experienced that, although I've had many experiences. I had not experienced that, and that was really, really painful for me to sit through. Most importantly, Blacks are nearly, and I said this, 3 times as likely to encounter law enforcement that end up in a deadly encounter. Someone is saying something. Do I need to open my chat feature? Let me take a look at chats real quick, Jennifer, before we move on. Somebody said the book's terrific, good. Someone chimed in saying all lives matter distracts from the problem we're facing right now. You're absolutely correct. It's not to devalue anybody else's life, but we really need to figure out how better to value those, especially young Black and brown men who encounter this particular institution. All right, next slide. Public policy. Oh boy. Here's another part of this conversation with the anger and frustration that we are seeing. And this one is even longer and has, I can't say it's more systemic. They're probably equally systemic. But this one plays out real time, and it plays out a little more subtle than law enforcement encounter. Because I don't think we truly understand and appreciate how we got into the environment where we live. We see a difference in investments where we live, and we don't see equal access to opportunity and resources where we live. I grew up in projects in Port Waco. I didn't know I was poor until I left Waco. Like, what? You guys actually have like public transit around this place? And all the other investments that I see, even in Omaha and across the world. I've been to like 40 different countries. I was like, man, we were really poor, but we just didn't know it. But here's the history on the public policy piece. The term redlining, if you didn't Google it, basically what it means, or what happened is, somewhere in the early 30s, as our country was starting to see this ballooning metropolitan area, especially in the industrial areas in the north, our government came together and said, hey, we need to do something about this these areas where all these people are now starting to congregate and come in for factory work. Let's put maps together, and we're going to invest in these areas. The problem with that, I think it was a great idea. The problem with that is we did a color-coded map. Every metro area in the state or in the country has a similar map. Kudos to Dr. Palmer Strand, Creighton University. She went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., pulled this map out and brought it back to us. All of us have been sharing this and using this as talking points since, but this is our redlining map. The green areas is A. Those are the prime areas that government were going to invest money for development. Area B would be second, the purple blue looking areas all over the, that cover the most portion of the map. Area C came third. Now you get to what we call those red shaded areas, area D. Those were called the redlined areas, and no investment went into those particular areas. When we look at current day Omaha and reflect on this map, where are areas D represented? Where would those areas be today? If you said North and South Omaha, kudos. Those would be areas D in the north, areas D in the south. Those were areas our government, when they started to largely invest in those metro areas, this is what happened. Most of our investments went to, I guess, what we would call West Omaha at the time, and some of our other surrounding areas. And those areas who probably needed them most did not get it. Next slide, please. So from that map, I'm going to show you all a series of maps, and then we'll kind of wind this thing down. But the rest of these are maps on how that original map, a policy decision, led to some of the things that we see today. This first map you're looking at, when we think about where folks can live, how we are investing, we as taxpayers, investing our money to support folks who may not necessarily be economically sustainable on their own at this point in time. This is where all of our subsidized housing is located, right? Can you back up one slide, Jennifer? And then we're going to do that quite a bit. Keep this map in mind, our redlining map. Okay, we go forward again. This is where we see all of our subsidized housing. Typically, where you see subsidized housing, you're going to see more folks at the lower, middle to lower, not always, end of the socioeconomic bracket. What's the problem with this map? Right? Those areas where we see all of this concentration of poverty, right? And via subsidized housing happens to be in the same areas where the government didn't invest in the first place. So now we have folks at the lower end of the income bracket who just so happen to be able to afford this subsidized housing, and we put them all in the same area. And I'm picking on Omaha right now, but every metro area I pull this map of, their data reflects the same. Next slide, please. Death rates. So we think about where folks live, redlining, where they live, and health outcomes. I shouldn't say death, health outcomes, right? Those areas in red are the zip codes with the shortest life expectancy in our area. You have 68104, 6811. If we went back to that original redlining map, I would believe that 68104, 6811 would probably be right in the middle of that redlined area that was in representative North Omaha today. Next slide, please. Homicides. If we look at the concentration of crime, and this is just homicides. I think if you look at some of the other smaller crimes like theft, vehicle break-ins, that data might look a little bit different, because if I'm a thief, and I'm not smart and I'm not a thief, but if I'm a thief, I'm probably going to go to more affluent areas to break into cars, because I typically know folks, those of us, once we start moving up the economic bracket, we go different places and we get lax. Like, you know, crime doesn't happen here. Well, crime does happen there. Crime is about opportunity, not necessarily location. So, but these are homicides in the Omaha area. If you said, wow, all of those are concentrated like in the north and central Omaha, you'd be correct. And they kind of line up with again, our original redlining map. Next slide, please. Access to jobs. You all know probably better than I do that a good portion of our best paying jobs are central to west, right? I say central because that whole Midtown, Blackstone, those guys, that stuff is kind of taken off. But you see the darker color would be where the jobs are, those jobs that pay the most. And then the lighter colors, the yellows and the lime greens, are the jobs that don't necessarily pay as much. Those particular jobs, or probably mostly service industry jobs, are, again, in those areas where we didn't get the initial investment. Next slide. And here we have two side by side, poverty and median home price. The lighter the color on the left, if you're looking at the poverty index, the lighter the color, the higher the poverty concentration. And in some of those zip codes like 68104, 6811, at the height of the, so pause for a second. When we went through the height of the housing bubble, or the economic crash before the pandemic, the state of Nebraska barely got over 3.4, 3.5 unemployment rate, the entire state. You went to certain zip codes, especially on the eastern part of the state and far western part of the state, and you would see unemployment rates at 18, 20, 22%, especially in some of those same zip codes that just happen to have the highest poverty concentration in our area. And that was difficult. For those who are familiar and were working in those spaces at the time, that was kind of difficult to deal with. Slide to the right shows the median home value. The brighter the color, or lighter the color, the cheaper the houses. The darker the color, the more expensive the houses. And again, we see most of those lower price housing, and we shouldn't be surprised at this point, are stacked and concentrated in our north to south central corridor, or eastern corridor, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. And just some information on Omaha. I think this data may be a few years old now, so I think it'll update here shortly. But home ownership. Why am I showing you a slide on home ownership and what's so important about home ownership and how does it intersect with public policy? The fastest way, a growing country, and most of the folks in that newly arrived to this country, two things that they needed to be to generate wealth. One was land, one was house, right? Real estate. If you owned it, at some point in time, somebody else wanted to acquire it. The railroads, the expansion of the interstate highway system, the growth of airports, the growth in housing. If you had land or you had a house that somebody eventually wanted, you would essentially build wealth, and that's still one of the fastest ways and best ways, safe ways to build wealth, and then pass it on to your kids, your grandkids, and the next generation. But what we see in this particular index to the left is that black males for being here, or not black males, black folks for being here nearly 4 centuries, we still lagging behind everybody else when it comes to home ownership rate. So that means we are still generating poverty at historically lower rates and slower rates than everyone else. That continued economic system or oppression of that system is gonna take a long time to unpack. This is centuries old stuff, and it didn't happen by chance. And while I would admit to you that I think that folks in my culture could do better with some of their finances, when I think about that, you have to put it in historical context. Initially, we were not allowed to buy and access a mortgage. Soldiers serving in World War I, World War II, who were of African descent, they come back home and they didn't get to participate in the GI Bill. So that's a policy decision that led to some of this. So we can debate how and what and all that other stuff, but we gotta keep in mind that some early policy decisions kind of set the Black community back for quite a while. To the right, just the median family income, and I think that's U.S. national, not just Omaha, U.S. national family, median family wealth, median family wealth today. right? I think those numbers. Finally, that original redlining map, if you think about it, put in context where it was, the ABCD, it essentially led to us being extremely segregated. Omaha is not much different than a lot of places that I would go to. But when I first arrived in Omaha 8 years ago, the first thing I did was jump in my little Mazda. Most folks know I got a little Mazda Speed 3. I love that little thing. And I circled the Metroplex. I hit the big loop, I hit the inner loop, I hit Dodge, 72nd, 75. I was all over the place. And something to distract, like, man, why does it feel like I just drove off a cliff in one part of the city? And it felt like that. And I come to learn this later that Omaha is a largely segregated community. It didn't happen without the influence of policy decisions that set us up that way. Next slide. If I had to summarize, so the two things we talked about, the historic nature of race in law enforcement, how public policy has impacted some of the communities of color, the African-American community, I would summarize it in one slide. Place matters. When I hear people say, I think one of the most contentious conversations I ever had with a professor was trying to convince me that, you know, just pull yourself up by your bootstraps and you can be successful in America. Well, I was, you know, I had traveled the world by then. I saw a lot of things. I was like, no, I don't know if that's the case. Because place can make a huge difference. Access to opportunity, mentors, resources, awareness, the education system, social capital from your parents. I mean, there's a lot of things impact that. I'm like, no, you can be pretty talented and courageous and still not necessarily be successful, depending on your definition of successful in America. But place matters. And I think what the frustration you're hearing from our young people with Black Lives Matter and the massive coalition of folks that are out there with them is these systemic institutions that have long been allowed to exist. We're not taking it anymore. And it's not just about law enforcement, although that was the crux of it. There are policies and economic decisions that are made at the local level that continue some of this other stuff that we're not doing this anymore, if I can put that in one place. So you see one door that's closed, one door that's open. My challenge and charge to all of you guys, when you get to that door, regardless of who you are, gender, your ethnicity, your race, turn around, reach back, pull some people through that door with you. Folks don't necessarily like to hear me say that. It's like, Earl, you're assuming everybody's prepared to walk through that door. I say to them, you're assuming that everybody is prepared, is not prepared, or want to walk through that door. So do keep that in mind as you all continue these conversations. Again, this is not something we can just have in one setting and say we completely understand all the issues. Next slide, please. Why is this important? When we think about our country is changing before our eyes. And for some folks, that's a struggle. They are angry, upset, attack on my culture. And I'm happy about that, but change is coming. Whether most of us on this call are here to see that change, it is coming, it's coming fast. Nebraska is coming with it. Maybe a little bit behind everybody else, but when I go to places now like Lexington, Grand Island, Schuyler, even Columbus, when I first went to those places in 2012, 2013, okay, you go out there now, I mean, Lexington, I was just out there like, oh my. There was so much diversity and a significant number of people of color out in Lexington that I was just like, okay, let me just partake in everything that's out here. But our country's changing. So we're really gonna have to get these policies and address some of these longstanding issues as we continue to see this change in demographic in our country. Next slide. A couple of resources we shared with you, and I'm just about done. Oh, it's good time. Books that you can read. There are 5 books here, 6 books here that are wonderful reads. I'd say read all 6 of them if you can. If you didn't, and you just wanted to read 2, Just Mercy and Color of Law, because Just Mercy discusses the criminal justice system, which is what we talked about, and the Color of Law addresses the policy piece. It specifically talks about redlining and some of those early policy decisions that led to the lack of opportunity for African Americans to participate in home ownership and others. But I say read them all because they really provide a breadth and depth and context of what we're talking about. And if you don't want to read, you're like, ah, man, I did my PhD, Earl. I'm not reading, or I did my master's. I'm not reading a nary book again. Great, you don't have to. There's a documentary called The 13th on Netflix. It specifically focuses on the criminal justice system, but you will see how the mass incarceration started and some of those wonderful data points where they talk about how this stuff impacts specifically African Americans, but Hispanics and Latinos are mentioned in that as well. And the numbers are pretty painful. Next slide. What can you do? I'm not going to tell you what I think you can do. Some opportunities to get involved, get engaged if you're really concerned about this. The first thing you have to do, you have to read and research. When I shared with you all in my opening, I didn't know much about the Holocaust or my own culture when I left high school. I didn't even hear the Holocaust until I was like 20 years old and I was stationed in Germany. Never heard of it. They didn't talk about it in my high school in Waco, Texas. Slavery, we skipped over it, and there was so much more about those 2 significant events that I found myself going back after school and have just been massively diving in to really understand and appreciate what those 2 experiences could have been like for folks. But you have to read for your own awareness and enhancement and your own edification. And I'll tell you what drove me to really dive in. I was in Richmond, Virginia. Not Richmond, Williamsburg, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. There's a plantation out there, and they may still do this, but they had a slave reenactment. And I was there with a group of folks who were doing a leadership program, and they had a gentleman who was white, and he was dressed in the attire of that day. And they had a African-American male, African-American female, and they had them in shackles. This big, huge tree stump. And they reenacted a slave auction for us, our leadership group. I'll tell you guys, and I don't talk about this a lot, but I lost my mind at that particular event. I was so emotional, I couldn't talk. I really couldn't do much of anything because at that point, I was already well into my 20s, 30s. It was at that point, the impact of what my ancestors experienced actually hit me. And since that point, I've really been on fire and with really trying to understand and appreciate the historical impacts of what that meant. So please read, you have to read. You can also volunteer. There's a number of different organizations you can volunteer with or get involved. My best advice though, before you just dive in and say, oh, I'm gonna go here and volunteer, call around or visit with folks and ask them what it is that they need volunteers to do. Because you might find out, I don't wanna volunteer for that. Or, I would say find out what it is that organizations are doing and then call and ask them, how can you help them if you want to get involved with them? Just showing up saying, I'm going to get involved, that may not go over well. It's just my experience. Regardless of what the movement is, just showing up and say, yeah, I'm here to help. Maybe not. Become a mentor. I serve as a mentor through Partnership for Kids. Wonderful opportunity. I mentored and I still hang out with 6 young men that I met in 7th grade. They're now all at 4 at Metro, 1 at UNO, and 1 at Southeast down in Lincoln. We still hang out now. Those guys are 19, 20 years old. Been out of school 2 years now. But some things that I was able to share with them, they were all Hispanic. I'm not Hispanic. And I didn't have the notion that I'm down there to save them, other than mentor them and share with them some of my experiences and help them navigate some things that maybe their parents or their families couldn't at the time. But it was a wonderful experience. All of those guys went on and they're doing great things, but being a mentor could be very helpful. And being a mentor though, I said something, if you didn't catch that, make sure you count that. We're not asking folks to be mentors to go down there and save folks. The Kids don't need, the young people, especially in the schools, don't need to be saved. They just need to know what they don't know. So do keep that in mind. And then those, yes, ma'am.
Could you potentially share with Jen a list of organizations that would be good places to reach out if we were interested in mentoring?
Oh, absolutely.
Awesome, thank you.
Yes. I'll send that to you, Brent. But the one place you can go that has all of those, NebraskaMentoring.org. It's based here in Omaha, and they have a collaborative mentoring organization. But I'm with P4K. I love those guys. We rock and roll. And then last thing's donate. You know, if you like me, I call myself old, grumpy, surly. I'm not out there with the young people marching. I am an advocate, but I'll give some resources. Here, you guys support, and then I'll come in and host some trainings, talk, dialogue, do community meetings. But my old bones, they're not gonna do well out in the sun, marching and protesting out in the sun, not these days. So with that, I think, Jen, that's the last slide. We can stop there and open it up for questions or further dialogue. Is that the last slide? I believe it is.
Yes, and I have just a short clip if
Yes, please share your clip. Oh, you know what?
And,
Before you
yeah.
share your clip,
Yeah.
there's one quote. Can we share that quote real quick? The last slide has a quote from, I think, Ball.
Yeah.
Yes. Think about this. Powerful quote from James Baldwin. I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. It's really not about guilt at this point. Guilt is a luxury I never had. We can no longer afford, right? I know you didn't do it. I know none of us did it because none of us was here at this time. And I didn't do it either. But I am responsible for it because I am a man. I'm a citizen of this country. You're responsible for it too, for the very same reasons. We can no longer pass this ball down the field or pretend it doesn't exist. It exists. We just have to be very thoughtful and methodical about where to get it and how to fix it. That's all I got.
The movie Just Mercy is available free on Amazon Prime Video.
Thanks, Marie.
Nice.
Earl, thank you very much.
So next up is a 4-minute clip, and this is a woman named Amber Ruffin, and she is a comedian, writer, and actor. She's been a writer for Late Night with Seth Meyers since 2014. She grew up in Omaha. She went to Omaha Benson, and she shares her experience, an encounter with the police. I'm assuming this is in Omaha, but we would have to ask her for sure. So
let me tell you a story.
does this work?
So once when I was a teenager, I was brand new to driving, and I dropped my friend off at work, and I'm coming back home and I'm in morning rush hour traffic, and everybody is going over the speed limit. I think it's like 40 and everyone is going 50, and I hate it because I'm new to driving. It's too scary. And when I slow down, it disrupts traffic. So I speed up to 45. That's 5 miles over the speed limit. That's as fast as I'm willing to go. And I know I'm going too slow, and I'm in an unfamiliar part of town, and people are whizzing by me. So to make myself feel better, I turn on Busta Rhymes, and I friggin' blast it so that, I can calm down. And blasting Busta Rhymes is something that I recommend if you're a teenager who is unsure of themselves. So I get to a good pace, and I start feeling normal. And just then I encounter a speed trap, and no one is slowing down. We are all speeding, me least of all. So to my right, there is an old white cop standing on the side of the road. And out of these tens of cars, he sees a young black person driving a purple car blasting rap music, and he chooses me, and he's screaming at me. He is shouting as if I have murdered someone. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, he is at a 27. And he goes, "Pull the car over, pull the goddamn car over right now, mother." That is what this cop is screaming at me. And I think this is how I die. This man is going to kill me. And I start crying. I am bawling because I am 100% sure that this man is going to drag me out of my car, beat me to death, And, you know, tomorrow on the news, everyone will be like, she didn't seem angry, but who knows? So I pull over and I stop. He goes, oh, car, dude. He's shouting. It does not stop. So he gets up to the car and he puts his hand on the door and he goes to start yelling, and he sees me. He sees a teenage girl whose face is wet with tears, and I'm just braced trying to think of all the good things that have happened in my life so that I get to heaven thankful instead of angry. And he looks me in the eye and he drops it and goes, oh, okay, well, it's okay. Just let me have your ID. And, you know, he's taken aback. He goes from a 27 to a -2. His whole demeanor changes. And it's as if he wasn't the guy who was just screaming at me. He's a totally different guy. All of a sudden he's nice. So, I give him my ID. He sends me on my way without a warning, because once he saw a teenage girl, shouting was no longer fun. Look, I have 1,000 stories like this. The cops have pulled a gun on me. The cops have followed me to my own home. And every Black person I know has a few stories like that. Many have more than a few. Black people leave the house every day knowing that at any time we could get murdered by the police. It's a lot. And sometimes when you see news footage like we have seen the past week, and you hear people chalking it up to a few bad apples instead of how corrupt an entire system is, it becomes too much. And that's what I wanted to say. And I wanted to end this with something hopeful to, you know, provide some comfort, but maybe it's time to get uncomfortable.
So this is the time that Earl wanted to make sure that we had a space for sharing and reflection.
As we think about that, and we'll leave it open to comments, and you all chime in. I've read through all of them you all posted over here during the video. But two things I'd also ask you to ponder and walk away with. One is if you are white, in particularly white males, I find I'm having some challenging conversations with, because I hear this, you know, my culture is under attack. Everything is PC, and, you know, my First Amendment rights. Two things I've shared with folks. And a lot of these guys I served with in the military. So we've been in some very austere environments. Some of those guys have saved my life. I've saved their life. We had some very candid conversations. What I said to them is, if that's the way you feel, imagine how I feel. We've never talked about race in my military group with my guys, and I served 25 years. We never talked about race because we didn't have to. We weren't forced to, right? It's a different type of camaraderie and brotherhood. But imagine how I feel if you think your culture is under attack. You think you have to be PC and that you can't say what you want to say. That's been my entire existence. And I think there are a number of folks, Black, brown, and other minorities. It doesn't necessarily mean, you can even be from, I say poor, because we forget about rural poor folks. Those experiences out there are pretty challenging. And if you are now feeling like that way, I say very crassly, welcome to America. What took you so long? Because the rest of us have been feeling like this for a long time now. And the second thing I say is, you're not under attack, right? But you do have an obligation. This particular issue does not change or get any better without white males specifically getting involved in this conversation and getting involved in the fight. It just is not going to happen. The last thing, and I want to hear from you all, leadership. The broader PowerPoint, because I sent Jennifer two. One is pretty extensive and it has a leadership component. This one we condensed down, leadership. We have to rethink, reimagine what leadership is or what it was, because we really need a new leadership model, from public leaders, private leaders, leaders in our home, in our communities. we need to rethink leadership, and that's what I'm excited about in my studies is what does this new leadership look like for a country that has changed over the last century and changed very drastically. So with that, I'm gonna stop. I want to hear from you all.
Is it okay if I speak for a minute? Okay. So one, thank you so much. Just a very emotional time, I think, for being a Latinx and what is happening right now has brought up so much as being brown, as being a female. You know, I moved here in 2005 from Northern California, and I have definitely seen and have lots of stories as well. But it wasn't until I moved here in Omaha that I realized just what a very different world. You hear the amazing things that Omaha will do with, you know, fundraising and community. You hear the word community all the time, but you know, Earl, you just did an amazing job describing all of it, because I did the same thing. I jumped in my car, drove around, and it just blew me away at the differences, and to see how, even with parks and schools, how money is spent here in Omaha. And I've been going to the marches. It's kind of in my blood. My mom, she was a paralegal for the United Farm Workers Movement. And so I've been going since I was in her belly. So it's something I'm very passionate about. But I think what, even talking with my 3 older children who are in college, you know, there were a lot of things that even I didn't realize that were not the best of views, just because I'm kind of, you know, I'm older, a different time. And it's about conversation. It's about those uncomfortable conversations, and being in a marriage where my husband is white and I have biracial children, even more so, you know, having to have those conversations to tell my children, you know, don't be rude when a cop pulls you over. Don't be rude if a teacher talks to you. Don't be rude to your boss, because maybe it might be a simple misunderstanding, but being a person of color, it's almost as if it's ingrained in us to be defensive and to try and always prove we're not doing anything wrong. You know, that's a fear I even have in my own job right now, which is kind of crazy, because I love where I'm at. I love the inclusivity. I love all of the diversity. But there are times where sometimes, you know, I just kind of go back to that way of thinking of, oh man, if something's wrong, am I going to be the one looked at? And so I know I'm kind of rambling. This is definitely a conversation, but just thank you so much just for even this, because this is how it starts. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing. Thank you.
I'm gonna go talk for a second, if that's okay. Appreciate the opportunity to be on a call and had a conversation. I guess before I begin, a little bit of my background is, out of college, I spent time as a diversity consultant, working with Minnesota Humanities and with Omaha Public School Systems, talking about racism, sexism, classism. And I've traveled the country looking at examining different situations within our country that's happened. And I think the biggest thing that's missing from the conversation is the educational part of the systemic racism itself. Like, I hear a lot of institutional racism, and I think before we even begin to have conversations, there must come a reckoning with the education and what we actually understand about racism. And so while I look at a lot of topics within the slides, you know, I agree with most. I think that for far too long, we have placated the conversation of racism, sexism, classism, all the isms, to make people feel comfortable, and that shouldn't be the case. In my opinion, in my work, I've worked at TD Ameritrade and Northwestern Mutual, and I do work in the world of finance. And I've been on board 3 different boards at Mutual of Omaha, TD Ameritrade, and Northwestern Mutual of diversity and inclusion. And the first thing that concerns me is at every corporation that I've been a part of that had the diversity and inclusion, it was more driven about the numbers of who we hire and how we hire, and not about how do we dive into the topic of racism and change ourselves. Because at the end of the day, the Jewish Community Center is a corporation designed to make money, like most corporations in America is. Jewish Community Center, Nike, any company we look at, there's not a moral compass that exists for that company. The mission is to serve the community and make money. It's the individuals within the corporation that have and should possess a moral compass, which is why we come to these conversations we are today. Right now, it's popular for a corporation to say, we stand on the side of Black Lives Matter. But in the next 2 months, so we have an election coming up, the next year, where those corporations and individuals stand at when this is no longer a popularity contest and it's popular to do the right thing? And I've seen corporations fall by the wayside when it comes to diversity and inclusion. And with that, it's the individuals within the corporation that we have to look at ourselves and say, how are we coming into the workforce, into the building? How are we leaving the building? Because you still go back to your communities, whether it's West Omaha or South Omaha or North Omaha, and we're still experiencing the same things. And so I look at the conversation that we're missing is, and one of the questions on the agenda was how we got here. And not just in this conversation or just within our country and global society, we miss the civilizational aspect of racism. Whereas there's been a civilization, the European civilization, in power for so long that their ways are now normal, neutral, and natural, whether that's by intent or not intentional. And so that civilization informs the institutions that are our workplaces, informs our societal understanding, our news outlets, and then that trickles down to the individual. So I don't care about the police officer that kills the Black person as much as I do as the civilization that continues to create that cop that can do that. And so as we start to look at how we can bring this to the Jewish Community Center, there is an article, and a couple of different articles I love, but one is by a multiculturalist named Christine Sleater. And she talks about the way in which when we have situations like this, the conversation can be diverted. So we go back to like the Black Lives Matter, and then someone said All Lives Matter, which is a complete deflection from the issue at hand. And so when we look at our white allies, and I will say it feels completely good to be to walk into a Walmart or a store or turn a TV on and have conversations where we have white allies in the fight. But I think that we have to sit back and understand the education behind it first before we can start talking about how we move forward. Because I think we then end up at the same situations. I had a great conversation with a friend yesterday and was telling her she watched the movie out of Omaha and was talking about she didn't understand some of these things, that how we still today as Black people in other areas of color, Latinos or Asians or whatever, there are ways in which we live that came from the 50s. As a kid, I knew the streetlights meant get home. That is a direct parallel to sundown towns where Black people could work in the town, but we looked at the streetlights as that's our signal to leave, because once that sun came down, didn't matter where you worked, who you were in trouble.
Yeah.
And so, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I was going to interject, but go ahead and finish.
No, so my point in all this is we like the conversation has to be completely uncomfortable, and before we can get to a point of what we do and how we do it, I think we have to understand what the system is and say what the system is, which is white supremacy and the social construction of race. And you know, I said that OPS has been doing some great work the last 10 years around all the isms with reconstructing curriculum. And I've seen where teachers have went into school systems and changed how they teach kids based on, the new information we're learning. So I would just always say, like, let's be cautious on the action part, because it is a slow moving train.
All right. So think about this, guys. I start off saying to you that first, Jared, very good comment, very, very pointed and on point. This is not a conversation you can have in an hour, one time, and say we understand the issues. That's totally not going to happen. I do think there's ways you can get involved, but you also have to understand. If there's nothing else you want to do, Jared mentioned education. Our public education system does not teach the holistic history of our country. So if we're going to dismantle that particular piece, we have to start earlier and not wait till we get 30, 40 years old and try to understand how did we get here from a civilization perspective. That's a whole different topic in how all of that stuff happened. So if you have and are interested in education, that's a place where you can get involved with the State Board of Education, local education districts, and we can challenge them to start thinking about that in a more broad and diverse perspective, that this is not an accurate reflection of the American history of the experience. There are a lot of things I didn't know until I left school, and I had to read and interact with folks all over the country and all over the world. It's like, what? That's in the textbook? Like, yeah, man, where you been? And then the second thing was, I'm a big advocate of, yes, we can do that. We can sit in the classroom. We can force the school districts and other institutions to teach a more holistic understanding of our culture. But I'm going to put the onus on the individual, right? We have to, as individuals, because Jaron brought up how you show up and how you lead the office. You have to, at some point, read for your own edification. Because a lot of people go to Wikipedia and click. Oh yeah, I found it on Wikipedia. As an adjunct professor, we don't allow folks to use Wikipedia in our institution, right? So think about that. Very good points. Anybody else, Jennifer? I don't want to take up the time, but anybody else want to talk? Comments?
Well, as I look around, there's a number of us that may have been part of the 60s civil rights movement and walking the streets and occupying buildings and doing all the things that were done. And I think at that time, everybody had some optimism that significant changes had taken place. And for me, over the years, as I look, I say, wow, did really that much really happen? And I guess what I'm interested in now, Earl and Jared is, what is your, I don't know if it's your gut reaction or whatever, how lasting and how significant a changes do you expect?
Here's my comment, Jared. You can chime in if you want. I don't mind. Here's what I understand from reading, because I was born on the back end of the civil rights movement in '68. Here's what I understand from reading that, and this is what I would really like to sit down and talk to a lot of our young people that are forcing us, I say old folks, forcing us older folks to come about, to come on board with this. Policy. As I understand a lot of the policies that came out of the civil rights movement, you think from 64 to 68, we really rewrote a lot of our public policy from the national level. And we did that really quick. We think about how we write policies at my federal agency. Typically, it takes 2 to 3 years to write a policy because so many people have to review it, get their hands on it, give you feedback. But in a 4-year span, we wrote the entire civil rights policies. Some of them had great outcomes. Some of them missed the mark altogether. So whatever it is that we think we're going to do in this space, we need to be very thoughtful, methodical, and we need to get lots of feedback onto what are we asking for in policy and what do those policies look like? Because the greatest intent can have the worst outcomes ever if we're not very inclusive and diverse with how do we dismantle and then restructure whatever it is that we're doing.
I agree with that. Something I've been thinking about the last few weeks, months since this has happened is how do you build a coalition toward voting? But with that, it comes more to just voting with how do you then restructure? I think the biggest time in American history when Black people were represented in legislation was during Reconstruction, but out of Reconstruction came Jim Crow. And so during Reconstruction, there was a lot of Black congressmen and women in legislation locally and on a national level. And so now it becomes, how do we begin to push more candidates of diverse backgrounds, but then also pull together as a community and begin to pull our votes toward candidates that are going to support legislation that is in the betterment of us. Your first point, you said, how long do we think it's going to last? And that's what I'm afraid of, is not just a topic of race, but in America, we are a very media-driven culture. And so it is always about the next big story. And we have a very short attention span. So that's where, with some of the people I know that's in the field still, we have conversations around, like, what do you do next? Because we are a very reactive society. We're not proactive. We should have been having these conversations a long time ago, not when, it took 8 minutes and 46 seconds for that cop to put his knee on George Floyd's neck. So that's what concerns me. And then when you look at how we divert from, the topics at hand, it becomes, well, the protests were good, but now there's rioting. And I mean, even when you look at local elections, we don't show up in droves to vote for the betterment of ourselves. So we have to drive ourselves to the voting booths, but also work to start to change voting laws as well.
Great point.
So thank you very much. Thank you everyone for coming. I do want to do this again. I want to do more. And so we had 60 people on this call. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's great for everyone showing up. And if we want to do something every couple of weeks, something once a month, email me, tell me what you want to see for this campus, and I will absolutely help make it happen. So thank you very much, Earl. Thank you so much. Very inspiring. Yes, thank you very much. And everyone have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Enjoy.
Thank you.